Friends, this is your 2-minute warning. If you would bring your conversations to a close, we're about to begin. I'd invite the people at the back of the room to close the doors to the hallway, if you would, please. We'll begin in just a minute. Good evening, conference. I'm glad to see you all here tonight for what I think will be a very important and helpful presentation. As we've been talking about, one of the 5 purposes of an annual conference session is learning. We had an excellent presentation from Dr. Maria Dixon Hall this afternoon. Tonight, we have an equally special guest. I've known Craig Hill for decades now. He's a New Testament professor, formerly with Wesley Theological Seminary and at Duke Divinity School. Perkins School of Theology was blessed last summer when he accepted the deanship of that school. I want you to know that his recent book, Servant of All, has been a huge blessing to me. I've read it, learned from it, marked it. It's not only deep in its understanding of the New Testament and its general message, but it also recognizes all of our humanity and the ways in which ambition and our personal needs fit in with the service of Christ. So there'll be a book signing for his book tomorrow at 10 o'clock, I'm told. And so I certainly had asked the bookstore to have lots of copies of his book around because I think it's a valuable resource for you all. Dean Hill is going to be introducing one of his staff that you ought to know, but there's another person that I want to be sure to introduce. Sam Martinez, would you stand up, please, and just wave to the group? Sam has just recently joined the Perkins staff as Assistant Director of Admissions for Recruitment. And so when we talk about finding people and helping them navigate the journey of theological education, Sam is somebody that you ought to know because we want to make it as seamless as possible for people who are hearing God's call to come into ministry. Well, I don't want to get in the way of Dean Hill's presentation, but just to tell you that one of my formative experiences for him, which will illustrate how he thinks, back when he was at Wesley Seminary, he began a video series to bring high-quality theological education to people outside the United States, to do that by video presentations. And he put together a whole network of teaching videos on important theological topics and recruited a bunch of people to make those videos. So that shows he was already thinking out of the box back 20 years ago. I anticipate that he's going to bring those same kinds of administrative and visionary skills to theological education. We as Wesleyan people believe that our clergy ought to be educated. After all, it was the Charles Wesley hymn that said, "Unite these two so long disjoined, knowledge and vital piety." This church, where we are, Woodlands United Methodist Church, has had a long commitment to theological education, and Craig and I are both the beneficiaries of some of the visionary work done by a Foundation for Theological Education. Well, Craig is bringing that now to bear on an important institution. We in the Texas Annual Conference have a deep relationship with Perkins. We have a Houston Galveston program that has served the needs of our conference well and is now sort of being rebooted as we seek to find how to build on its strengths for the future. Perhaps Dean Hill is going to say a word about that in his introductory presentation. But Craig, we welcome you to the Texas Annual Conference. We're thrilled that you took the time to be with us tonight and tomorrow morning, and we hear you gladly. Please welcome Dean Craig Hill, Perkins School of Theology.
Thank you, everyone. You saw the suit coat, right? I can get rid of that. I moved to Dallas back in July, and I said, I now know why my Viking forebears never invaded Texas. It's just... So those of you in the sound room, there we go. Thank you, if I can get that. Thank you so much, Bishop Jones, for your generous invitation to be here and introduction. It is a great pleasure for me to come tonight to represent Perkins School of Theology. I bring to you heartfelt greetings from our faculty and staff, especially to the hundreds of Perkins graduates who are here in the Texas Annual Conference. You know, before coming to Perkins, I was first a student at Garrett, later a faculty member at Yale Divinity, then Wesley Theological Seminary, and then Duke Divinity before they finally admitted me to Perkins. Now, each of those schools serves a vital purpose, and I still root for them all, along with whoever that was out there. Every one of them serves a vital purpose and has a certain niche. Similarly, everyone in Texas Methodism, not just our graduates, has a very large stake in the future of Perkins. The stronger Perkins is, the more it will draw talented students to this region, the more capable it will be of training faithful leaders, and so the better off all of us here in this room will be. And so for that reason, I'd like to say just a few words about my first 11 months at Perkins before moving on to my main subject. Now, like anyone taking on a new role, I spent quite a bit of time this past year listening, especially listening to church leaders throughout the South Central jurisdiction. I've heard a lot about what they like and don't like, want and don't want in theological education. For my part, the thing I've wanted to communicate most is my deep love of and concern for the local church. I am an ordained United Methodist elder myself. I worked in churches for a little over 10 years. And I see Perkins first and foremost as a partner with and servant of the church. Now, these conversations I've had have already led to some changes. For example, beginning this fall, we will offer 2 new elective concentrations for master's students at Perkins. The first is in response to the request I've often heard that our graduates come to ministry better equipped to actually lead a church. And so the first of these, if I can get that, my clicker is not working. I may have to, okay, there we go. The first of these is a concentration in church management, taught in conjunction with SMU's Cox School of Business. Another need is to provide training for persons who intend to work in non-traditional settings, such as operating a nonprofit social justice ministry. For them, we created a concentration in social innovation and nonprofit engagement in cooperation with SMU's Meadows School of the Arts, Division of Corporate and Public Communication and Public Affairs, partly led, in fact, that concentration by Maria Dixon Hall, whom you heard this afternoon. You can find more information about those concentrations, of course, by talking to people at the Perkins table. I could mention a number of other things. I do want to move on, but let me say at least one other thing. I am a very firm believer in the importance and the value and the future of the Perkins Houston Galveston program. I want to see it thrive. I want to see it become all that it could be. For that reason, I appointed a director to the program. And, okay, he's right here. This is Ugo Magianes. Ugo brings great skill, energy, and experience to this role. He's already been meeting with leaders of the conference, and I'm sure he'd be very happy to meet with you and hear your ideas, your suggestion, and gain your support. Ugo, would you mind standing so folks can identify you? Thank you. I'm also delighted to announce that Bishop Jones himself, formerly of the Perkins faculty, will be teaching in the program this fall. That is a delight to me personally. In short, Perkins, the Perkins faculty, all of us together are here at your service. And speaking of service, a deliberate segue. There we go. I've been asked to give a talk based on a book of mine that was published a few months ago. It's not my intention to spend the entire time talking. If I get some time, I'm going to give you a couple minutes here and there to talk to each other, so you don't have to just listen to me. But the main point is to talk about this book titled Servant of All, Status, Ambition, and the Way of Jesus. It comes, as you can see, from a verse in Mark 9, verse 35. Jesus sat down, called the 12, and said to them, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. I'm going to get at that quotation from a rather odd angle here for just a second. See if you know where this quotation comes from. If you do, you're probably about my age or older. I love humanity, it's people I can't stand. It's Linus. Yeah, Linus in the Peanuts cartoon. It's Linus in the Peanuts cartoon. Okay, we in the church are in the loving humanity business. Then why is it so darned hard to get along with actual people? Including church people, including even clergy. Human behavior is very complicated, and I don't mean to single out one cause as the only cause, but some well springs of human action go a lot deeper than others, and it's one of the deepest of the deep that I want to focus on this evening. It affects all of us just as it affected all of the New Testament communities, as we'll see in a little while. Let's start here. Beyond mere survival, to what are we most directed? Now, a lot of things occupy our attention: what we'll eat, what we'll wear, how we'll accomplish the tasks before us. All those things concern us, but none of them quite dominates our lives in the way that something else does. That thing is so central that it's been called simply the project. The project. I started working on my project when I was very small, quite smaller than I can consciously remember. The time I bought my mother a present with my allowance, the time I mowed the lawn or did something else for my dad without being asked. It really did happen occasionally, once in a while. Little did I know that I was hard at work on my project. The criticisms and childhood taunts that stung, the disappointment at not being chosen part of the group. Little did I understand that the hurt that I felt was that of a project threatening to fail. Now, people have variously described the project. It's been called the quest for meaning, the desire for significance, the need for self-esteem and purpose. Beneath it all is the question, who am I? Or more pointedly, do I matter? I remember very well my first girlfriend and the euphoric rush of feeling I had in those first dating experiences. Here was another person, a girl, who thought I was somebody. You know, with apologies to Robin, my dear and let me say utterly irreplaceable wife, there is still nothing quite like holding hands with the first girlfriend, boyfriend. All the same, you might recognize that in its own way, that first love, for all of its emotional intensity, can be rather self-centered and small. In many respects, I was preoccupied with myself, with the sense of worth that came through her to me. Now, nevertheless, that was one of the high points in the history of my project. You can see what a tawdry business this whole thing has been. You might readily think of some of your own. Your winning team in high school, being elected to some office, closing a great deal, getting that tall steeple appointment. You might also recall some of the low points, the memories that sting to this day with their razor of recrimination. Just when you thought you were getting somewhere, that had to happen. Now, it's the pervasiveness of the project that's so interesting. It lurks around every corner. It's in the very prejudices, intentions, and dreams that guide our lives. What impression will I give by my dress, my speech, my possessions, my job title? Do others in the office think I'm a good employee? Am I a good father, mother? Was I being myself when I behaved that way the other night? How am I doing? How am I doing? We all thrive on recognition and other signs of personal value, be they claps or plaques or Cadillacs. And woe be unto those who do not sufficiently recognize us. I believe that the great majority of the whispers, pains, tensions, and divisions that occur within any church have at their most basic level this dynamic of hurt feelings and wounded pride. Fail to show enough deference to the wrong person, and you've got a potential schism on your hands. How much theological disagreement is really about ego? And pastors are no different. They didn't say as much about my sermon this week. Am I doing all right? Maybe I should have gone into insurance after all. To put it rather satirically, we all have a propensity for enjoying the company of those who share our own best estimate of ourselves. Now, it would be inaccurate to conclude that the project is wrong. It's not in itself wrong. It is an unavoidable, in fact, an essential part of what it means to be human, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. But that's not to say that the enterprise is without its problems. Indeed, this quest for significance is downright treacherous. Among the problems are these. One, this one's obvious, really. If I derive my sense of worth through some particular possession, skill, or attribute, what happens when that thing is lost or taken away? What do you say to the person who loses his or her career, fortune, good looks? Investing in a project is a risky business. What place is there for failure in such a system? It is because of the project that love unrequited can so easily turn to hate. The second problem is much like the first. If I consider myself to be valuable because I'm the best answer guy at the company, what happens when someone comes along with better answers or better sermons in our context? Competition, jealousy, suspicion, gossip. Most of our projects stand on shaky ground, and we meet the threat of a rival by throwing up a sudden defense, maybe even counterattack. So much is at stake. Third problem, self-centeredness. The whole thing requires continual maintenance and constant self-evaluation. What are they thinking of me? It is so often impossible to be aware of others because we are so absorbed in ourselves. Even without malice, a project pushes self-consciousness strongly in the direction of selfishness. 4, the need to be a success, to be a somebody, promotes in us illusions of our own goodness. We need to justify ourselves, to use biblical language. And in order to do so, we lie to others and to ourselves about the kindness of our intentions, the extent of our innocence, and the purity of our cause. Someone has called reputation minus what you get caught at. It's easy to forget what you didn't get caught at. 5, none of this answers the question of whether the value we're deriving from something is even legitimate. Somebody out there is probably happy knowing they've carved out the biggest drug ring in all of metropolitan Houston. What foundation is there for determining real meaning from pseudo-meaning? Or is there any such distinction? When it's all said and done, is it just about how I feel, how you make me feel? 6, finally, every strictly human project must, in a most vital respect, fail. I may be a somebody, I may stay a somebody all my life, but the end of all my striving, like it or not, is going to be the grave. As Christian author Tony Campolo says, they always tell you that when so-and-so died, he was worth $5 million. I want to tell you, when you die, you ain't worth nothing. They will take you out and put you in a hole in the ground and go back to the church and eat potato salad. $10,000 years from now, 10 million years from now, who is going to be around to know that you existed, much less care? Now, if that's so, why do we care so much what others think of us? In no small part, it's because of our biology, our genes. We are social animals. In fact, we are by far and away the most social of all animals. We have language, of course. which is an incredibly powerful social adaptation. But this is true of us even beyond words. Only humans have 52 separate facial muscles tied to a complex web of nerves which cause us, most often unconsciously, to express our emotions visibly, facially. We are inherently, inescapably, deeply social creatures. That's how we are wired. And social creatures are, to varying degrees, conscious of status, of where they fit in the group. Social consciousness conveys a number of benefits to the group, whatever animals we're talking about, including diversification of roles, better protection against predators, increased food gathering capacity, assistance with rearing offspring, and so on and so on and so on. But there are costs as well as benefits. Most animal societies exhibit a dominance hierarchy, which means that its benefits are not distributed equally. For example, an individual lower down on the pecking order is likely to live more on the periphery, be in greater danger, eat less, be less well-groomed, and reproduce less, if ever. The alternative, however, can be near constant disorder, competition, and strife, making the entire herd, pack, flock, troop, or pride less productive and more vulnerable. In his seminal work, Leadership Without Easy Answers, Ron Heifetz of Harvard University outlines the similarities and differences between gorilla and chimpanzee societies. Didn't know you were going to get this out of a New Testament scholar, did you? We'll get there. He then lists 5 functions performed by the dominant individual of both species. 1, choosing the direction of group movement, protecting the group from predators, orienting members to their status and place, controlling conflict, and maintaining norms, including norms of mating and resource allocation. As I wrote in my book, quote, "This comes eerily close to being the job description of a seminary dean." Please note that I wrote that before I knew I was going to be a seminary dean. It does appear that God has a sense of humor. Now, I find this stuff fascinating. For example, in the book, I reviewed some studies of stress and depression in baboons. The interesting thing is if you study those, they overlay more or less perfectly with Harvard Business Review articles on workplace dysfunction. What doesn't work in a baboon troop also doesn't work in a church office, it turns out. We are not the only creatures who get down in the dumps by being on the losing end of a social encounter. Another author wrote about what he called our status sonar. Ping! Every time you walk into a room, what your brain is unconsciously doing is figuring out where you fit into that group. Now, the fact that our subconscious mind is constantly working on this issue is important. The extent to which it does, and it does to a very great extent, varies depending on your physiology, but it is present to some degree in all of us, probably to a much greater degree than we would be likely to want to admit. A boost in status is rewarded physically by, among other things, an increase in serotonin, dopamine, and testosterone, stuff that makes you feel good. It lights up the reward center of the brain. Conversely, threats to status affect us physically. Enough threats to status can make you sick. In short, it's natural. This is all natural. But here's the rub. Natural drives are inherently ambiguous. They're like fire that can warm the house or burn it to the ground. Let me give you a couple of examples. Sex and food. Now, I don't think anyone here would want to say those two things are evil. They are pleasurable naturally because they are necessary to the survival of the species. There's a reason they're pleasurable. Just to give you the safer of two examples, that's the reason I love brownies and cheesecake. Naturally, yeah, I'm staying safe. Naturally pleasurable. We are programmed to eat as many high-density calories as we can precisely because they are scarce in nature. This is a case of an adaptive behavior that becomes maladaptive in an environment of superabundance. I don't live on the African savanna. I live a mile away from a Tom Thumb supermarket that's open 24/7. I can get cheesecake anytime I want. So living with these impulses, it's like navigating a road with a ditch on either side. The ditch on one side is indulgence. It's only natural. Do what you feel. If you follow that without any regulation, you will probably hurt yourself and you will certainly hurt other people. The ditch on the other side is repression. I'm going to knock this thing down. It's kind of like whack-a-mole. You hit it here, what's the problem? It pops up somewhere else. Probably in disguise, probably in more dangerous form. Rather like the preacher of an otherworldly gospel who gets caught up in a sex scandal. Repression and indulgence. How do we live Christianly with these natural drives? I think the same thing can be said for this craving for status, this craving to be a somebody. There's a deep tension surrounding it. It's one of those can't live with it, can't live without it things. This interest in awareness of status is both a highly productive and a highly destructive capacity. At its most productive, I think it is one of the sources, one of the underlying impulses for religion. Religion doesn't just ask the question, do I mean anything? It asks, does the universe mean anything? Does anything matter? But it is also the source of so much, perhaps for us most, selfishness, discord, unhappiness. You could extend the long, long list of social sins with this at its root. And you know what? No surprise, clergy are not immune. Ever been to a national ministers' conference? It's not hard to figure out who the stars are, what they had to do to get there. In pretty much every way that the church might ape the wider world's celebrity culture, we do. Some churches much more than others. There's a helpful concept that you probably already know that I think is a good bridge here into the New Testament. It's the concept of the significant other, and I define the significant other as the person or person whose opinion of us we solicit and believe. Our identity is formed socially, but not everybody tells us who we are with the same effect. At first, it's a parent, often an opposite-sex parent. Then it becomes, for many, the infamous peer group. As adults, it's often some combination of a spouse, boss, colleagues, or this undifferentiated they. Wait till they hear about this. Wait till they hear about this. They. Who is the mirror you look in to see yourself, to tell you who you are? On the other side of that ledger, whose disapproval bothers you the most? I'm going to take just a minute, maybe 2 minutes, give you a chance to talk to those around you. Try to answer one or both of these questions. For whom are you a significant other? And how does that affect, or how should that affect, how you behave? And who are those 2 or 3 or 4 people whose opinion of you has most shaped you? Let me just pause for a minute or two and give you a chance to talk together. Okay? Got that figured out? All right, good. All right, so what does this have to do with the New Testament? A lot, it turns out. A lot. Many of the New Testament churches, certainly the ones we know the most about, were highly distinctive communities. They included highborn and lowborn persons, literate and illiterate, Gentiles and Jews, masters and slaves. The most natural thing in the world would be for those communities to import existing status hierarchies into the church. And that is the very tendency against which many New Testament authors actively fought. That actually is quite remarkable. It's easy for us to take it for granted. I think it's very important and very much worth paying attention to. Now, first, though, I've got to give you a little bit of background. It's difficult to overstate the importance of social standing in the Greco-Roman world, most often calculated in terms of degrees of honor. That's the word that they would use to talk about it most often, the degrees of honor. There's a great book by John Lendon called Empire of Honor, The Art of Government in the Roman World. And this is what he says: honor was a filter through which the whole world was viewed, a deep structure of the Greco-Roman mind, perhaps the ruling metaphor of ancient society. Honor was all important. According to the Greek orator and philosopher Diochrysostom, quote, "Neither you nor any others, whether Greeks or barbarians who are thought to have become great, advanced to glory and power for any other reason than because fortune gave to each in succession persons who were jealous of honor and regarded their fame in after times as more precious than life." How's that for an unabashed endorsement of glory-mongering, right? We tend to be a bit more subtle, right? So tell us, why are you running for elective office? Well, to be honest, I finally want to prove those jerks in high school wrong. Nah, that's probably not. Interestingly, the Roman philosopher and politician Cicero described the love of honor as something natural, a natural desire. Nature, in fact, not only puts up with, but even demands it, for she offers nothing more excellent, nothing more desirable than honor, than renown, than distinction, than glory. Nature has made us enthusiastic seekers after honor, and once we have caught, as it were, some glimpse of its radiance, there is nothing we are not prepared to bear and go through in order to secure it. Such was the world of much of the New Testament, into which many early Christian communities were born. You receive honor from those below you, you give honor to those above you, and you compete constantly for honor with those around you. Now, these early Christian communities were, in their ideals, remarkably countercultural, remarkably egalitarian, at least in the sense of valuing all people. So it is, for example, that the Apostle Paul in Romans 12 says, outdo one another in showing honor. Not in receiving honor, outdo one another in showing. You know who shows the most honor? The person on the bottom. Outdo one another in showing honor. Philippians 2, he says, regard others. The verb is to reckon as though. Reckon as though others are better than yourself. This is very un-Roman advice. Now, at least that's the ideal. It's the ideal below which every Christian community falls, beginning, in fact, with the very first group, the disciples. They got there ahead of us. Let me read you a couple of passages from Mark. There are lots more of these in the book. It's amazing how much of this stuff, how like us the disciples really were. Then they came to Capernaum, and when Jesus, was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" "Oh, fine points of Christology. Eschatology." "No." They were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. A couple chapters later, James and John, sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." That's a pretty brazen thing, isn't it? "Give us whatever we want." "What is it you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right and one at your left in your glory." Now, what's even worse about this is that both of these things occur immediately after Jesus had predicted his death, which they didn't get, of course, in Mark. They're clueless. The disciples, especially as they're portrayed in Mark, represent those who are attached to but misaligned with Jesus. Attached to but misaligned with Jesus, like all of us at times. They were like workers in a presidential campaign hoping to ride the boss's coattails into high office. And Jesus' response to that first text is exactly what we already saw in Mark 9. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. You know, it's interesting that here and elsewhere, Jesus doesn't say, "You dunderheads, you shouldn't want significant lives." He doesn't say that. What he does do fundamentally, categorically, is redefine the terms of significance. Now, key text, probably above all texts, is John 13, of course, the foot washing story. You probably already know this. Foot washing is the job for the lowest person in the house, probably a slave. Even to this day, the foot is unclean in the Middle East. That's why people threw shoes at the fallen statue of Saddam Hussein. It is servile. It marks you out as someone unimportant if you do this job. I don't know, have you ever had a job like that? I've had a couple jobs like that. I was a page a couple of times in the Illinois State Senate, and it's amazing what you hear in that environment from senators and governors and stuff. It's kind of like being one of the servants in Downton Abbey. It's like, he doesn't matter. You're just sort of invisible, right? That's what it meant to be a foot washer in those days. So it's no surprise that these disciples who argue with each other about who's the greatest and so forth aren't going to do that job. To do so would be to confirm the other's high opinion of themselves and their low opinion of you. So as we read this text, consider this. Who was the significant other or others for the disciples and for Jesus? And also cue on the verb to know. Very important verb in John. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Actually, we haven't even gotten to love here, but so many of these passages that deal with status deal with love, interestingly. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. Jesus was the only one in the room who knew who he was, and therefore the only one free to serve. The only one who knew who he was, and therefore the only one free to serve. That is a position of remarkable strength, not weakness. On the other hand, the egocentrism displayed by the disciples, so dependent as they were on the opinion of the others, demonstrates their fundamental weakness. This hamster wheel of egocentrism keeps us, like them, from service, from true happiness, from personal fulfillment, from deep and meaningful connection with others, including God. Those who would save their lives will lose them. The most unhappy people I know have one thing in common. They're scorekeepers. They are constantly keeping score. You find yourself when you lose yourself in something larger than yourself. Now, not surprisingly, the primary strategy of the New Testament authors in dealing with this very persistent problem was to cite the example of Jesus. It's not hard to do. It's there in his whole life, of course. His very humble birth and parentage, his hometown. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Nathanael asks. His associations throughout his ministry. One of the most extraordinary things about Jesus was the fact that he deliberately associated with people who could do nothing to advance him socially. In fact, who associating with lowered him socially. He died the most humiliating death possible, a slave's death. Usually crucifixion was reserved for slaves. Romans were brilliant at creating theatrical punishments, especially around issues of status, which they valued so much. And the worst thing they could do was put you up publicly on a cross, strip you naked, and make you look helpless and weak in front of everyone. That is why when Roman authors talk about crucifixion, they don't usually talk about the pain, they talk about the shame of crucifixion. It's why in Hebrews 12:2 it says about Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising its shame. The author of Hebrews understood. And then you think about Jesus' followers, no great shakes, most of them. So it is to this Jesus that the New Testament authors again and again refer. And this is perhaps the most famous of these passages, so-called Christ hymn in Philippians 2. Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, to be grasped, held on to, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Being born in human likeness and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. This stair steps down of Jesus self-emptying. Now, we know that passage, and it's a very popular passage among New Testament scholars who like to argue with each other about exactly what it means and what it means for Christology and Jesus' life in God, et cetera, et cetera. What is missed so often is why Paul even has it there. What was the reason for including that? It wasn't because they needed a lesson in Christology. It was because apparently there was bickering in the church at Philippi, most likely among some of the leaders. So if you look at the immediate context, if you don't skip over it, this is what comes right before it. Do nothing from selfish ambition. We'll get to ambition in a bit. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, etc. That's why it's there. And you see this over and over. When you read the New Testament and you get to a passage that's a Christological passage about the identity of Jesus, like the servant passages in Mark, pay attention to the work it's doing. Because what you will see again and again is it's there to help believers get along with each other, especially where differences in status were an obstacle to fellowship and true discipleship. Now, a lot of the best examples of all of this, how to deal with status and so forth, come in the Corinthian letters. It's not surprising because for multiple reasons. One is that we know so much more about Corinth than about any other church in the New Testament time. But another is that the city of Corinth itself was just status crazy. And Christianity for a lot of the Corinthians was merely a new means to a very old end, that is social advancement. Let me quote Anthony Thistleton in his magisterial commentary on 1 Corinthians says this: with today's postmodern mood, we may compare the self-sufficient, self-congratulatory culture of Corinth coupled with an obsession about peer group prestige, success in competition, their devaluing of tradition and universals, and near contempt for those without standing in a chosen value system. All this provides an embarrassingly close model of postmodern context for the gospel in our own times. I like to use, I'll give you my kind of analogy. You ever see the British sitcom Keeping Up Appearances? Okay. The main character is Hyacinth, and if we can read that, she says, drive very slowly past number 23, I want her to see my hat, okay? Hyacinth comes from a lower class British family. She is married into a solidly middle class family, but she is obsessed with climbing the social ladder. Her last name is actually spelled Bucket, but she pronounces it Bouquet, okay? I like that analogy because the Corinthians were sort of like buckets wanting to pass as bouquets, like most of us. Now, I've heard it said that a leader is someone who helps others to conceptualize reality. In some ways, this was a natural thing for Paul to do because his own reality, his own world had already been turned upside down. In his conversion, Paul saw that God had acted supremely through not a victor, but a victim, through the instrument of a cross, a place of weakness, foolishness, suffering, and humiliation. Hence, claims to power, giftedness, wisdom, and glory may well reveal human lostness, not divine favor. For Paul, the model of discipleship is uniquely the self-emptying of Jesus, as we already saw in Philippians 2. And it's at that point especially that Paul's theology aligns precisely with that of the Gospel of Mark. On the other hand, Paul had a significant challenge. He took a humble role. He worked with his hands. That was low class in those days, doing things with your hands. He didn't receive pay for speaking. Also low class. He was not an accomplished orator as much as some others. His physical presence, he says, is unimpressive, which mattered in those days just as it does today. So to a significant extent, by his own deliberate choice even, he occupied a place of relatively low status. And that was not something that endeared him to the status-conscious Corinthians. So much of what's going on in Corinth, if you read Corinthians, it's not really about arguments of theology, it's about arguments of status and position. Paul thus attempts for his audience to reconceptualize reality, to show them a different way of thinking about the world and therefore about themselves. So I want to go through a few of these passages with you. These are familiar, but maybe you'll read them in a little bit different way now. Paul begins in chapter 1 by trying to set up this whole argument, 1 Corinthians. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, shame being the opposite of honor. To shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. Paul, on the road to Damascus, his world turned upside down. This is how God works. This is where God is present in the world, in a crucified Messiah. So that's where God is working in Paul's life as well. Now, he ends with the word boast. Boast is one of the key words, of course, throughout all the Corinthian correspondence. Most famously, it's front and center in some of those final chapters in 2 Corinthians. Look at just a little bit of that, where Paul talks about boasting and weakness. He says, if I must boast, and the Corinthians seem to have driven him to this, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ knows I don't lie. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas has guarded the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. That may not strike you this way, but to a first century hearer, that would be a humiliating story. Paul snuck out of town, hidden in a basket in the dark of night over a wall. To a Roman reader, this would be in very stark contrast to the honor that a Roman warrior would receive if he had been the first one to scale an enemy wall. Paul flees over a wall, and he's the one who tells the story. He moves on, says, "Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated." Just to pause there for, nobody knows what this was. Everyone can speculate about this forever. Possibly eye disease. Paul talks about his weakness of the flesh. He went to the Galatians because of a problem with his eyes. He said, if you could pluck your own eyes out and give them to me, you would. So maybe it's that. I don't know. I'll ask when I get there. Okay. I'm going to have a great Bible study after I die. Okay. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am content with weakness, with insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities for the sake of Christ, for whenever I am weak, there I am strong." It's hard to see God at work where human strength appears a sufficient agency. For that reason, Paul would instead highlight his weakness, his insufficiency, to demonstrate the authenticity of his ministry. It's a very counterintuitive move. It's a brilliant move. Paul's apostleship is validated by the strange but wonderful calculus of the cross. Let me mention just a couple of other things here very quickly about ways that Paul reconceptualizes reality for the Corinthians. The Corinthians' fault, do you remember Peter at Caesarea Philippi? Paul says something very similar to them that Jesus says to Peter, that they think as humans think, not as God thinks. "I could not speak to you as spiritual people," which obviously they thought themselves to be. "I could not speak to you as spiritual people, but rather as people of the flesh." Now, this is a real insult to a Greek. You're a person of the flesh, not spiritual. "Even now, you're still not ready, for you are still of the flesh." Now, pause there for a second. Modern readers may jump on this phrase, people of the flesh, and think, Paul, that old killjoy, must be talking about sex. Nope, not here. The natural impulse he wanted to challenge is something else, now very familiar to us. "For as long as there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving according to human inclinations? For when one says, 'I belong to Paul,' and another, 'I belong to Apollos,' are you not merely human?" You ever name drop? I have. It is an incredibly easy way of achieving status by association. It is insidious and it is pretty darn normal. Even in the church, maybe especially in the university. Okay. By all accounts, spiritual gifts were distributed liberally amongst the Corinthians. The Corinthians were sort of like people who've been given chess pieces and went on playing checkers. They didn't know what to do with what they had, and so they defaulted to the familiar game. Spiritual endowments became status markers, especially the esoteric gift of speaking in tongues. Paul does a number of things with this. First, he makes it clear that these are gifts, not rewards. He says in chapter 4, "What do you have that you didn't receive? And if you received it, why do you boast as if it were not a gift? You might as well boast of being born." Paul's argument is that all believers, not just an elite few, are so gifted. He goes on to say, "To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually as the Spirit chooses, not as the person deserves." And here's the clincher. He says, "To each is given for the common good. There is therefore no ground for jealousy. The gift given one benefits all. All require the gifts given to each other." It's a lot like a church potluck, or in England we would say a bring and share supper. All benefit from the varied abilities of each. Indeed, the more varied the abilities, the better the supper. 30 Jell-O salads doth not a potluck make. Right? Of course, humans being human, even a bring and share can become a bring and compare. Corinth tempts us all. It's in this context that Paul gives one of his best-known images, the church as the body of Christ. All parts of the body are necessary to and benefit the whole. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. You ever remember this part, though? If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. We rejoice in honoring others. That reminds me of my father's favorite saying I often heard growing up. It's a quotation attributed to Harry Truman. It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't worry about who gets the credit. Paul's masterstroke comes in chapter 13, of course. So you want spiritual gifts, do you? Seek to possess the best gift of all, love. That move brilliantly undercuts all these other claims to superiority. The highest spirituality is manifested by those who, quote, are not envious or boastful or arrogant. Moreover, the very spiritual gifts the Corinthians glory in are destined to pass away. They are only temporary, even childish expedients. It's faith, hope, and love that abide, and the greatest of these is love. It is acceptable to want the greatest gift, but that very gift will empower you to put aside striving and to live in harmony with, not above, others. Now, there is so much more in the New Testament on this subject. You could write a book about it. Let me give you one more example before moving on, though, to something else. I talked about this constant competition for honor. Honor was seen to be a zero-sum game. It was a limited good. There was one exception to this, though. Very, very interesting. One exception. You competed with everyone around you, okay, except for this. Plutarch, a contemporary of Paul, advised his readers that one ought, quote, in the first place, to make his brothers partners in those respects in which he is considered to be superior, adorning them with a portion of his repute, adopting them into his friendships, and if he's a cleverer speaker than they, to make his eloquence available for their use, as though it were no less theirs than his. In other words, the family is the one place you don't compete for honor. In the family. You share it, you build others up. I think this is probably the reason the New Testament authors default to familial language when describing relationships within the church. A particularly striking example of this, of course, you probably know what's coming, is Paul's letter. I can get it up here. There we go. Paul's letter to Philemon about the runaway slave Onesimus. I'm appealing to you for my child Onesimus, whose father I've become during my imprisonment. Perhaps this is the reason he was separated from you for a while. That's a wonderful divine passive, as if Onesimus didn't do anything. He was separated. So that you might have him back forever, no longer a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. Especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. Do you get a glimpse of what a radical countercultural edge there is to this shift in language? How it fundamentally redefines relationships. We don't use this language much anymore, and I realize it very easily becomes hackneyed and trite, but I miss it. I miss it because of the good work that it does. Brothers and sisters. Okay. Now, the book goes on to talk about other letters of the New Testament. It's a chapter called Saints Elsewhere. I'll skip over that here. Then it turns to chapters on ambition and hierarchy, and I'm just going to do a tiny bit with that, and I want to give you another chance to talk to each other, give you several things you can settle in 3 or 4 minutes. I like this quote. Ambition and hierarchy are like status ambiguous categories, right? That's why I have two quotations here. One is one that's often used by motivational speakers who want to whip up a crowd. "Intelligence without ambition is a bird without wings," said Salvador Dali. Okay. I also quoted what Agustin Magaldi is portrayed as saying in the musical Evita. He sings, "Eva, beware your ambition. It's hungry and cold, can't be controlled, will run wild." Ambition and hierarchy. I'll give you a little homework for just a few minutes, then we'll get back together. See if you can solve these, all right? What distinguishes good and bad ambition and hierarchy? Okay? How is ambition good? Where or when is it bad, etc.? How is each manifested in your church? Okay, what is your church ambitious for? Where does it have hierarchy? How about the United Methodist Church? Let's talk for a couple of hours. No. For what ought your church to be more ambitious, if anything? And okay, bring this down to the personal level. How do we overcome our very human tendency to self-deception and rightly judge our own ambitions? That has got to be one of the hardest things to do spiritually, to judge our own ambitions. You've got a good 5 minutes to solve all these, so go right ahead. Okay. The little clock on the clubhouse wall tells me that it's time to move on. Trying to figure out if anybody here is as old as I am. Yeah, it's the Mickey Mouse Club. Okay, just a bit more. Did you get all that solved? Okay, then tell me later. I'd love to know the answer to all those things. I'm just going to highlight a couple quick things from those chapters and then draw this to a close. One idea that was very prominent for me in the chapter on ambition was to try to make a distinction between vocation on the one hand, which comes from the Latin word for calling, vocation and career. And there's a subtle but I think very important difference between those two. The great danger is to move from a focus on vocation to a focus on career. To a very large extent, the exercise of our vocation is in our hands. Paul could be in prison and still exercise his vocation as an apostle. Our career, on the other hand, is very largely determined by factors beyond our control, not least just when and where you're born. Vocation is often other-centered. Career is often self-centered. Pastors who become embittered may get that way due to a misplaced focus on career. What often happens, it seems to me, and not always, but sometimes knowing some folks about my age, is you go into ministry with a real sense of vocation. You get in for a few years and you see how the system works. If I do the right sort of things, if I'm on the right sort of committee, I know the right sort of people, maybe I can move up. Maybe I can move up the ladder, with the long-term goal of getting that appointment. In my home conference back years ago when I was there, this may be different now, but back years ago when I was there were really two very prominent pulpits in the whole conference. I don't know, 40, 50, 60 people at any given time thought they wanted those appointments, deserved those appointments. Those appointments open about every 20 years. That is a recipe for frustration, disappointment, even anger. Now, that's not to say that ministers should give no thought to where they will be most fruitful, most useful, and even most happy. I think they'd be fairly poor stewards of their gifts if they did not. But in reality, however, they probably will be required to exercise their vocation in ways and in places they neither expected nor desired. Whether they then flourish or not has everything to do with their motivation, their vocation. If the desire of their heart is to be useful, there is limitless need and so endless opportunity. If their sole ambition is to be pastor of the largest church in the state or the executive director of the denominational missions agency, well, that narrows things quite a bit. Again, it is natural to want to employ one's talents to the fullest extent. It is a joy and a privilege to get to do that, and in a perfect world, that would always be possible. This is an imperfect world, however, and only a tiny minority of people throughout human history have had the chance to be all that they can be. Think of the millions and millions of Russian serfs, European peasants, American slaves, who might have been great doctors, teachers, engineers, musicians, had the door been open to them. And the situation was that much worse for women of every background and class. That might seem like a set of extreme examples, but they are in fact the norm in historical terms. Now, of course, I do not want to encourage defeatism and resignation. It should be our constant aim to do excellent work to the glory of God. No one has been ordained to the vocation of mediocrity. Nevertheless, it is a fact that some soil is more productive and some toil is more rewarded. We work the field in which we have been placed, adjusting our labors and expectations to its conditions. Success in one patch might look quite different from success in another. We shouldn't forget that service is not fair. But then again, neither is salvation, neither is grace. The chapter then goes on to look at words that have to do with ambition in the New Testament broadly and more specifically with motivation. I won't go into these, just mention one of them. Very common word in the New Testament is the word zeal. And like almost all these words, it's used both negatively and positively. I'll give you one example of each. James chapter 3, verse 16. Where there is zeal and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. Be a good theme verse for the whole of what's wrong with us, right? Where there is zeal and selfish ambition, there is disorder and wickedness of every kind. On the other hand, you have John 2:17. Jesus' disciples remembered then what was written, zeal for your house will consume me. It's interesting to compare those two texts. See the difference between the source and the object of the zeal in each. Let me move on. Hierarchy. Well, one thing the New Testament does not endorse is class or caste. One of the most remarkable things about the New Testament, again, that we might just take for granted, is the extent to which it is egalitarian. Famously, of course, Galatians 3:28, there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, you are all one in Christ Jesus. There's an awful lot of that in the New Testament, a lot more than we might think. In fact, if you bring it all together, assemble it in one place. But that's not to say the New Testament is against structure either. It's inchoate, it's simple, it's relatively flat, but there is structure. There were leaders. Of course, there are the offices in the New Testament. They're not really quite offices at this point of deacon, elder, bishop, or overseer in various forms and so forth. I end that chapter by listing several lessons. I'll just mention one or two of these to you. One is that the New Testament authors did not reject leadership, hierarchy, structure, but much of what they wrote did serve to undermine the given hierarchies of their day. It's interesting to see to which end of this scale, when you're looking at the New Testament, later interpreters go for inspiration and confirmation. The fact that both sides of so many controversies, monarchists and revolutionaries, slaveholders and abolitionists, nationalists and internationalists, conservatives and liberals, can find support in the New Testament shows how mistaken it is to attempt to replicate the structure of the New Testament church, the attitude of the biblical authors, without reference to context, either theirs or ours. There's a story. I've got to get this in here. I'll skip a bunch of stuff just to make room for this story because I love this story. Whenever I taught New Testament intro, I would always try to explain why context matters so much. And this is the story I would tell. I was a student at Oxford University years ago, and one of the things I did was row crew in a boat with 8 rowers and a coxswain at the back yelling at you, stroke, 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 which if I did it now would have new meaning, but back then, And the Thames is not very wide in Oxford. That's where the ox could ford, remember? So rather than line the boats up alongside each other, they lined them up like this along the bank, about a boat length and a half apart. The object was literally, when the cannon sounded, was to get out into the river and literally to try to bump the boat ahead of you. If you did that, in the next race, you would leapfrog that boat and jump ahead of it. You would go up around a big bend in the Thames, which they called the Gut. You rowed for your college. In my case, that was Christ Church, John Wesley's undergraduate college, just to name drop. You row for your college. A lot of them had ecclesial names. There's even a Jesus College, St. John's, Magdalene, which they pronounce Magdalene there, and so forth. And what you tried to do is be the last one across the finish line on the last day of the race. And then the next year, you would literally start the race where you left off the year before. It was like a race that never ended, okay? All of that makes perfect sense if you're in that rarefied, odd world, but it's very confusing to outsiders. And so the story goes that there were a couple of American tourists who came to Oxford once, and one of them, they were there during Eights Week, one of the race weeks, and one of them said to the other, I don't get it. Somebody ran by me all excited saying that St. John had bumped Jesus in the gut. Okay. It's possible to have an interpretation that is literally true and wildly wrong because it doesn't know the context. And certainly when it comes to reading the New Testament and reading the New Testament around these issues, it's important to do that. I'm going to skip over a lot of that other stuff. There's a book you can read that's got this stuff in it. I do want to say one of the final things I said in there about all this is that all human structures and offices are impermanent and under judgment. All leaders are temps. All of us are in this for a very, very short while who have any privilege to do this kind of work. The book ends with a chapter called, In Conclusion, Where Do We Start? Now, I want to tell you, I hate writing conclusions of books. My conclusions are always the shortest chapters in any book. I feel like it insults the reader to walk back through and tell you everything, that's already been said. Moreover, I don't feel like I want to tell you how to apply this stuff for yourself. That's work for you to do. But I did want to do a few things in there, and I mentioned, I'll just mention 3 points if I can click to them. Apparently not. Well, skip C.S. Lewis. Let's go back here. Okay. It is God, Paul says in Romans, it is God who justifies. All of us need desperately to be justified. The question is, who does the justifying? How do we get justified? Can we have the faith that God is our significant other, the one whose opinion of us we most solicit and believe? Justification by faith takes faith. It really does. Because everything around you is telling you that if you just own this or look like this or you do this, something more, maybe just for a moment, you'll be justified. But it isn't true. It can't be true. There is only one person in the universe capable of justifying, and that is God, who loves us and who has already done the work of justification. But you got to believe it. That's the hard part. Moreover, justification is something that we experience together. We are instruments of God's grace and instruments of God's justification for one another. At least we should be. That should be some of the work that we are doing in the church. One of the stories in the New Testament that most haunts me is the story of the widow's mite, a widow who had a couple of bronze coins and put them in the offering at the temple. This is a person who was invisible to everyone else, passed over, not noticed, except by Jesus. She is the one whom Jesus honored. That story haunts me. I don't mean to single myself out, but that has stuck with me over the years. There are many days when I drive to work, and my prayer is, God, help me to see that widow in someone today. Who is it that I should be paying attention to and respecting and honoring, who is largely invisible out there? I think a great way of testing anyone's character is how they treat those beneath them, so-called, especially when no one's looking. How do we do that in the church? The church needs to be the place where the things God honors are honored. To whom do we pay attention? Whom do we serve? And of course, this means creating a culture of service. Jesus said, I am among you as one who serves. That leads me full circle all the way back to Perkins. These New Testament teachings should have a profound impact on a school of theology, even a school of theology located in a university. I'm not sure outside of the military if there's any institution that is more rank conscious than the modern university is. It's extraordinary. One of my favorite quotations here, I'll get to the C.S. Lewis slide here. C.S. Lewis, after spending decades teaching at Oxford and Cambridge universities, wrote this, very close to the end of his life. We must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about their own dignity and advancement. where everyone has a grievance, where everyone lives the deadly serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment. That sounds like some universities I've known, not SMU. Sounds like some churches I've known, not Methodist. Okay? It is very important that we nurture a distinctively Christian culture, that we nurture that at a place like Perkins, so that our students can have the resources necessary when the going gets tough to lead as servants and not simply serve as leaders. To have the depth of character and depth of faith to do that. Not over 5 years, but over a lifetime. That's my hope for Perkins. It's my hope also, of course, for this annual conference and much more broadly for the United Methodist Church. With that, I'll close. Thank you.
I'm deeply grateful that Dean Hill made himself available to be with us tonight for two reasons. One, Perkins is important to the future of the Texas Annual Conference, and I wanted you to know his heart, his scholarship, and his abilities. And I'm grateful that he was able to share that with us tonight. But the second reason is really more important and closer to what his whole purpose was tonight. That again, we need a fresh reading of the New Testament, a deep understanding of the context that shaped it, and a fresh awareness that God has called us to be servants, that it's really not about a career and achieving a certain level of success measured in worldly terms, but it's really about how God can use us if we make ourselves available to serve God's purposes in the world. That's the message of the book. That's the message we've heard tonight. Craig, we're deeply grateful for your sharing with us. Friends, that brings our evening to a close. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Good night.